talking out right now before we go and read chapter 4 of The Invisible Man by, what's his face? I think it's H.G. Wells. But yeah, this is the Wisehouse Classics edition. You've been sick all week, so extra tired. I'm so sorry. VR, you really need to go to sleep then. But I've had my food, my drink. I'm ready to read. You guys ready for some Freaky Friday fables? You excited? I will be reading from my Kindle, so don't be upset if I'm like looking down or whatnot. That's just how we're gonna do this. Anyways, let me get comfortable. Get the mic all up in my face and say hello. Alright, there we go. Going to be really, really close to the mic. It's gonna look weird. I'm just kidding. I might just put it in my lap. I don't know. I'm doing alright. I have school on Monday, and then real school doesn't start until August, so here we are. Ready? Chapter 4. Mr. Cuss interviews the stranger. I have told the circumstances of the stranger's arrival in Epping with a certain fullness of detail, in order that the curious impression he created may be understood by the reader. But excepting two odd incidents, the circumstances of his stay until the extraordinary day of the club festival may be passed over very curiously. There were a number of skirmishes with Miss Hall on matters of domestic discipline, but in every case until late April, when the first signs of penury began, he overrode her by the easy expedite of an extra payment. Hall did not like him, and whenever he dared, he talked of advisability of getting rid of him. But he showed his dislike chiefly by concealing his contentiously and avoiding his visitor as much as possible. Wait till the summer, said Miss Hall sagely, when the asterisks are beginning to come, and then we'll see. He may be a bit overbearing, but bills settled punctual is bills settled punctual. Whatever you like to say. The stranger did not go to the church, and indeed made no difference between Sunday and the irregularious days, even in costume. He worked, as Miss Hall thought, very fitfully. Some days he would come down early and be continuously busy. On others he would rise late, pace his rooms, fretting audibly for hours together, smoke, sleep in the armchair by the fire. Communication with the world beyond the village he had none. His temper continued very uncertain. For the most part, his manner was that of man suffering under most unendurable provocation, and once or twice things were snapped, torn, crushed, or broken in spasmodic guts of violence. He seemed under a chronic irritation of the greatest intensity. His habit of talking to himself in a low voice grew steadily upon him. But though Miss Hall listened conscientiously, she could make neither head nor tail of what she heard. He rarely went abroad by daylight, but at twilight he would go out, muffled up invisibly, whether the weather were cold or not, and he chose the loneliest path, and those most overshadowed by trees and banks. His goggling spectacles and ghastly bandaged face under the penthouse of his hat came with a disagreeable suddenness out of the darkness upon one or two homecoming laborers, and Teddy Humphrey, tumbling out of the scarlet coat one night at 9:30, was scarred shamefully by the stranger's skull-like head, He was walking hat in hand, lit by the sudden light of the opened inn door. Such children saw him nightfall dreamt of bogies, and it seemed doubtful whether he disliked boys more than they disliked him, or the reverse. But there was certainly a vivid enough dislike on either side. It was inevitable that a person of so remarkable an appearance and bearing should form a frequent topic in such a village as Ypeng. Opinion was greatly divided about his occupation. Miss Hall was sensitive on the point. When questioned, she explained very carefully that he was an experimental investigator, going gingerly over the syllables as one who dreads pitfalls. When asked what an experimental investigator was, she would say with a touch of superiority that most educated people knew such things as that, and would thus explain that he discovered things. Her visitor had had an accident, she said, which temporarily discolored his face and hands, and being of a sensitive disposition, he was adverse to any public notice of the fact. Out of her hearing, there was a view largely entertained that he was a criminal trying to escape from justice by wrapping himself up so as to conceal himself altogether from the eye of the police. This idea sprang from the brain of Mr. Teddy Henfrey. No crime of any magnitude dating from the middle of or end of February was known to have occurred. Elaborated in the imagination of Mr. Gould, the probationary assistant in the National School, this theory took the form that the stranger was an anarchist in disguise, preparing explosives, and he resolved to undertake such detective operations as his time permitted. These consisted, for the most part, in looking very hard at the stranger whenever they met, or in asking people who had never seen the stranger leading questions about him, but he detected nothing. Another school of opinion followed Mr. Fearon's side, and either accepted the piebald view or some modification of it, as, for instance, Silas Durgan, who was headed to assert that if he chooses to show himself at fairs, he'd make his fortune in no time. And being a bit of a theologian, compared the stranger to the man with the one talent. Yet another view explained the entire matter by regarding the stranger as harmless lunatic, that he had the advantage of accounting for everything straight away. Between these main groups, there were waverers and compromisers, Sussex folks from few superstitions, and it was only after the events of early April that the thought of supernatural was first whispered in the village. Even then it was only accredited among the women folk. But whatever they thought of him, people in Ypeng, on the whole, agreed in disliking him. His irritability, though it might have been comprehensible to an urban brain worker, was as amazing the thing to these quiet Sussex villagers. The frantic gesticulations they surprised now and then, the headlong pace after nightfall that swept him upon the round, quiet corners, the inhuman bludgeoning of all tentative advances of curiosity, the taste for twilight that led to the closing of doors, the pulling down of blinds, the extinction of candles and lamps. Who could agree with such the going-ons? They drew aside as he passed down the village, and when he had gone by, young humorists would up with coat collars and down with hat brims, and go pacing nervously after him in intimidation of his colt bearing. There was a song popular at that time called The Boogeyman. Miss Stachel sang it at the schoolroom concert and in aid of the church lamps. And thereafter, whenever one of the two villagers were gathered together and the stranger appeared, a bar or so of this tune, more or less sharp or flat, was whistled in the midst of them. Also belated little children would call "Boogeyman" after him and make off tremendously elated. Cuss, the general practitioner, was devoured by curiosity. The bandages excited his professional interest. The report of thousands and one bottles aroused his jealous regard. All through April and May, he coveted an opportunity of talking to the stranger, and at last, towards Whitsuntide, he could stand it no longer, but hit upon the subscription list for a village nurse as an excuse. He was surprised to find that Mr. Hall did not know his guest's name. "He gave a name," said Miss Hall, an assertion but was quite unfounded. "But I didn't rightly hear it." She thought it seemed so silly not to know the man's name. Cuss rapped at the parlor door and entered. There was a fairly audible imprecation from within. "Pardon my intrusion," said Cuss, and then the door closed and cut Miss Hall off from the rest of the conversation. She could hear the murmur of voices for the next 10 minutes, and then a cry of surprise, a stirring of feet, a chair flung to the side, a bark of laughter. Quick steps to the door. Cuss appeared, his face white, his eyes staring over his shoulder. He left the door open behind him and, without looking at her, strode across the hall and went down the steps, and she heard his feet hurrying along the road. He carried his hat in his hand. She stood behind the door, looking at the open door of the parlor. Then she heard the stranger laughing quietly, and then his footsteps came across the room. She could not see his face where she stood. The parlor door slammed, and the place was silent again. Cuss went straight up to the village, to Bunting, the vicar. "Am I mad?" Cuss began abruptly as he entered the shabby little study. Do I look like an insane person?"
What's happened?"
said Vicar, putting an ammonite on the loose sheets of his forthcoming sermon. "That chap at the inn."
"Well?"
"Give me something to drink," said Cuss, and he sat down. When his nerves had been steadied by a glass of cheap sherry, the only drink the good vicar had available, he told him of the interview he had just had. "Went in," he gasped, and began to demand a subscription for that nurse fund. He'd stuck his hands in his pocket as I came in. He sat down lumpily in his chair, sniffed. I told him I'd heard he took an interest in scientific things. He said yes, sniffed again, kept on sniffing all the time, evidently recently caught in an infernal cold. No wonder, wrapped up like that. I developed the nurse idea, and all the while kept my eyes open. Bottles, chemicals everywhere, balances, test tubes and stands, and a smell of evening primrose. Would he subscribe? Said he'd consider it. Asked him point blank, was he researching? Said he was. A long research? Got quite cross. A damnable long research, said he, blowing the cork out, so to speak. Oh, I said. And out came the grievance. The man was just on the boil, and my question boiled over him. He had been given a prescription, most valuable prescription. What for? Wouldn't say. Was it medical? Damn you! What are you finishing after? I apologized. Dignified sniff and cough. He resumed. He'd read it. 5 ingredients, put it down, and turned his head. Draught of air. From window lifted the paper, swish, rustle. He was working in a room with an open fireplace, he said. Saw a flicker, and there was a prescription burning and lifting chimneyward. Rushed towards it just as it whisked up the chimney. So, just at that point, to illustrate his story, out came his arm. Well? No, hand, just an empty sleeve. Lord, I thought that's a deformity. Got a cork arm, I suppose, and has it taken off. Then I thought, there's something odd in that. What the devil keeps that sleeve up and open? If there's nothing in it, then there was nothing in it, I'll tell you. Nothing down it, right down to the joint. I could see right down to the elbow. Through a tear of cloth? God! Good God! I said. Then he stopped, stared at me with those black goggles of his, and then at his sleeve. Well? That's all. He never said a word, just glared and put his sleeve back in his pocket quickly. I was saying, said he, that there was a prescription burning, wasn't I? Interrogative cough. How the devil, said I. Can you move an empty sleeve like that? Empty sleeve? Yes, I said. An empty sleeve. It's an empty sleeve, isn't it? You saw it was an empty sleeve. He stood up right away. I stood up too. He came towards me in 3 very slow steps and stood quite close, sniffed venomously. I didn't flinch, though. I'm hanged if that bandaged knob of his and those blinkers aren't enough to unnerve anyone coming quietly up to you. You said it was an empty sleeve? He said. Certainly, I said. At staring and saying nothing, a barefaced man on spectacles starts to scratch. Then very quietly he pulled his sleeve out of his pocket again and raised his arm towards me as though he would show it to me again. He did it very slowly. I looked at it, seemed an age. Well, I said, clearing my throat, there's nothing in it. He had to say something. I was beginning to feel fright. I could see right down to it. He extended it straight towards me, slowly, just like that, until the cuff was 6 inches away from my face. Queering thing to see an empty sleeve come at you like that, and then, well, something exactly like a finger and a thumb. It nipped my nose. Bunting began to laugh. There wasn't anything there, said Cuss, his voice running up in a shriek at the there. It's all very well for you to laugh, but I tell you, they're so startled. I hit his cuff hard, I turned around, and cut out of the room. I left him. Cuss stopped. There was no mistaking the sincerity of his panic. He turned around in a helpless way and took a second glass of the excellent vicar's very inferior sherry. When I hit his cuff, I'll tell you, it felt exactly like hitting an arm, and there wasn't an arm. There was a ghost of an arm. Mr. Bunting thought it over. He looked suspiciously at Cuss. It's a most remarkable story, he said. He looked very wise and grave indeed. It's really, said Mr. Bunting, with judicial emphasis, a remarkable story. Chapter 5. The burglary at Vicarage. The facts of burglary at the vicarage came to us chiefly through the medium of the vicar and his wife. It occurred in the small hours of Whit Monday, the day devoting an evening to the club festivities. Miss Bunting, it seems, woke up suddenly in the stillness that comes before the dawn, with the strong impressions that the door of their bedroom had opened and closed. She did not arouse her husband at first, but sat up in bed listening. She then distinctly heard the pad, pad, pad of bare feet coming out of the adjoining dressing room and walking along the passage towards the staircase. As soon as she felt assured of this, she aroused the Rev. Mr. Bunting as quietly as possible. He did not strike a light, but putting on his spectacles, her dressing gown, and his bathing slippers, he went out on the landing to listen. He heard quite distinctly a fumbling going on at his desk downstairs, and then a violent sneeze. At that he returned to his bedroom, armed himself with the most obvious weapon of the poker, and descended the staircase as noisily as possible. Miss Bunting came out on the landing. The hour was about 4, and the ultimate darkness of the night was past. There was a faint shimmer of light in the hall, but the study doorway yawned impenetrably black. Everything was still except the faint creaking of its stairs under Mr. Bunting's tread, and the slight movements in the study. Then something snapped, the drawer was open, and there was a rustle of papers. Then came an imprecation, and a match was struck, and the study was flooded with yellow light. Mr. Bunting was now in the hall, and through the crack of the door he could see the desk and the open drawer, and a candle burning on his desk, but the robber he could not see. He stood there in the hall undecided what to do, and Miss Bunting, her face white and intent, crept slowly downstairs after him. One thing he kept Mr. Bunting's courage, the persuasion that the burglar was a resident in the village. They heard the chink of money and realized that the robber had found the housekeeping's reserve of gold, 2 pounds, 10½ sovereigns altogether. At that sound, Mr. Bunting was nerved to the abruption act. Gripping the poker firmly, he rushed to the room, closely followed by Miss Bunting. "Surrender!" cried Mr. Bunting fiercely, and then stooped amazed. Apparently the room was perfectly empty, yet their conviction that they had that very moment heard somebody moving around in the room had amounted to certainty. For half a minute, perhaps, they stood gaping. Then Miss Bunting went across the room and looked behind the screen, while Mr. Bunting, by the kindred impulse, peered under the desk. Then Miss Bunting turned back the window curtains, and Mr. Bunting looked up the chimney and probed it with a poker. Then Miss Bunting scrutinized the waste paper basket, and Mr. Bunting opened the lid of coal scuttle. Then they came to a stop and stood with eyes interrogating each other. "I could have sworn," said Mr. Bunting. "The candle," said Mr. Bunting. "Who lit the candle?" "The drawer! And the money's gone!" She went hastily to the doorway. Of all the strange occurrences! There was a violent sneeze in the passage. They rushed out, and as they did, so did the kitchen door. Slam. "Bring the candle," said Mr. Bunting, and led the way. They both heard a sound of bolts being hastily shot back. As he opened the kitchen door, he saw through the scullery that the back door was just opening, and the faint light of early dawn displayed the dark masses of the garden beyond. He is certain that nothing went out of the door. It stood open for a moment, and then closed with a slam. As it did, so did the candle Miss Bunting was carrying from the study flickered and flared. It was a minute or more before they entered the kitchen. The place was empty. They refastened the back door, examined the kitchen, pantry, and the scullery thoroughly, and at last went into the cellar. There was not a soul to be found in the house, search as they would. Daylight found the vicar and his wife, and quaintly costumed little couple, still marveling about their own ground floor by unnecessary light of guttering candle. Chapter 6. The Furniture That Went Mad. Now it happened that in the early hours of Whit Monday, before Milly was hunted out for the day, Mr. Hall and Miss Hall both rose and went noiselessly down into the cellar. Their business there was of a private nature, and had something to do with the specific gravity of their beer. They had hardly entered the cellar when Miss Hall found she forgotten to bring down a bottle of sarsaparilla from their joint room. As she was the expert and principal operator in this affair, Hall very properly went upstairs for it. On the landing, he was surprised to see that the stranger's door was ajar. He went into his own room and found the bottle as he had been directed, but returning with the bottle, he noticed that the bolts of the front door had been shot back, that the door was in fact simply on the latch, and with a flash of inspiration he connected this with the stranger's room upstairs and suggestions of Mr. Teddy Humphrey. He distinctly remembered holding the candle while Miss Hall shot these bolts overnight. At the sight, he stopped, gaping, then with the bottle still in his hand went upstairs again. He rapped at the stranger's door. There was no answer. He rapped again, and then pushed the door wide open and entered. It was as he expected. The bed, the room also was empty. And what was stranger, even to this heavy intelligence, on the bedroom chair and along the rail of the bed were scattered the garments, the only garments so far as he knew, the bandages of their guest. His big slouch hat even was cocked jauntily over the bedpost. As Hall stood there, he heard his wife coming out of the depths of the cellar, with that rapid telescoping of the syllables and the interrogative cocking up of the final words to a high note by which the West Sussex villager is wont to indicate a brisk impatience. "George! You got what I want?" At that, he turned and hurried down to her. "Jenny!" or "Jenny," he said, over the rail and cellar strips. "Tells the truth what Humphrey says. He's not in his room, ain't he? And his front door's unbolted." At first, Miss Hall did not understand, and as soon as she did, she resolved to see the empty room for herself. Hall, still holding the bottle, went first. "If he ain't there, his clothes are. And what's he doing without his clothes, then? 'Tis a most curious business," he said. As they came up the cellar steps, it was after ascertained fancy they heard the front door open and shut. But seeing it closed and nothing there, neither said a word to the other about it at that time. Miss Hall passed her husband in the passage and ran on first upstairs. Someone sneezed on the staircase. Hall, following 6 steps behind, thought he heard her sneeze. She, going on first, was under the impression that Hall was sneezing. She flung open the door and stood regarding the room. "Of all the curious," she said. She heard a sniff close behind her head, as it seemed, and turning was surprised to see Hall a dozen feet off on the topmost stair. But in another moment he was beside her. She bent forward, put her hand on the pillow, and then under the clothes. "Cold! He's been up this hour or more." As she did so, a most extraordinary thing happened. The bedclothes gathered themselves together, leapt up suddenly into a sort of peak, and then jumped headlong over the bottom rail. It was exactly as if a hand had clutched them in the center and flung them aside. Immediately after, the stranger's hat hopped off the bedpost, described a whirling flight in the air through the better part of the circle, and then dashed straight at Miss Hall's face. Then as swiftly came the sponge from the washstand, and in the chair, flinging the stranger's coat and trousers carelessly aside, and laughing dryly in a voice singularly like the stranger's, turned itself up with its 4 legs at Miss Hall, seemed to take aim at her for a moment, and charged at her. She screamed and turned, and then the chair legs came gently but firmly against her back and impelled her and Hall out of the room. The door slammed violently and was locked. The chair and bed seemed to be executing a dance of triumph for a moment, and then abruptly everything was still. Miss Hall was left almost in a fainting condition in Mr. Hall's arms on the landing. It was with greatest difficulty that Mr. Hall and Millie, who had been aroused by her scream of alarm, succeeded in getting her downstairs and applying the restoratives customary in such cases. "'Tis spirits! I know it's spirits! I've read in papers of it. Tables and chairs leaping and dancing." "Take a drop more, Jenny," said Hall. "'Twill steady you." "Lock him out! Don't let him come in again! I half guessed I might have known. With them goggling eyes and bandaged head and never going to church of a Sunday. And all they bottles more in it's right for anyone to have. He's put the spirits into the furniture. My good old furniture! 'Twas in that very chair my poor dear mother used to sit. And when I was a little girl, to think it should rise up against me now." "Just a drop more, Jenny," said Hall. "Your nerves is all upset." They sent Millie across the street, through the golden 5 o'clock sunshine to rouse up Mr. Sandy Wagers, the blacksmith. Mr. Hall's compliments and the furniture upstairs would be having most extraordinary. When Mr. Wagers come around, he was a knowing man, and Mr. Wagers, and very resourceful. He took quite a grave view of the case.
I'm damned if they ain't witchcraft,
was the view of Mr. Sandy Wagers.
You want horseshoes for such a gentry as he is.
He came around, greatly concerned. They wanted him to lead the way up the stairs to the room, but he didn't seem to be in any hurry. He preferred to talk in the passage. Over the way, Huckster's apprentice came out and began talking down the shutters of the tobacco window. He was called over to join the discussion. Mr. Huckster naturally followed over in the course of a few minutes. The Anglo-Saxon genius for parliamentary government asserted itself. There was a great deal of talk, no decisive action.
Let's have the facts first,
insisted Mr. Sandy Wagers.
Let's be sure we'd be acting perfectly right in bustin' that there door open. A door unbust is always open to bustin', but you can't unbust a door once you bust it in.
And suddenly the door of the room upstairs opened of its own accord, and they looked up in amazement. They saw descending the stairs a muffled figure of the stranger staring more blackly and blankly than ever with those unreasonably large blue glass eyes of his. He came down stiffly, slowly, staring all the time. He walked across the passage, staring, then stopped.
"Look here,"
he said, and their eyes followed the direction of his gloved fingers and saw a bottle of sarsaparilla hard by the cellar door. Then he entered the parlor and swiftly, viciously slammed the door in their faces. Not a word was spoken until the last echoes of the slam had died away. They stared at one another.
"Well, if that don't lick everything," said Mr. Wagers,
and left the alternative unsaid.
"I'd go in and ask him about it,"
said Mr. Wagers to Mr. Hall.
"I demand an explanation."
It took some time to bring the landlady's husband up to that pitch. At last he rapped, opened the door, and got as far as, "Excuse me."
"Go to the devil," said the stranger in a tremendous voice, "and shut that door after you."
So that brief interview terminated. What are we on? Chapter 4 we started? Alright, last chapter, guys. Chapter 7, The Unveiling of the Stranger.
You just said chapter 4.
Yeah. We started with chapter 4.
Now you're in chapter 7.
Because we went 5, 6, and now we're on 7. Chapter 7, The Unveiling of the Stranger. The stranger went into the little parlor of the Coach and Horses about past in the morning, and there he remained until midday, the blinds down and the door shut. And the doors shut, and none after Hall's repulsive venturing near him. All that time he must have fastened. Thrice he rang the bell, and third time furiously and continuously, but no one answered him. "Him and his go-to and devil indeed," said Mr. Hall, or Miss Hall. Presently came an imperfect rumor of the burglary at the vicarage, and two were put together. Hall, assisted by Wagers, went off to find Mr. Shuckleforth, the magistrate, and take his advice. No one ventured upstairs. How the stranger occupied himself in unknown. Now and then he would stride violently up and down, and twice came an outburst of curses, a tearing of paper, and a violent smashing of bottles. The little group of scared but curious people increased. Miss Huckster came over. Some gay young fellows, resplendent in black ready-made jackets and paper ties, for it was White Monday, joined the group with confused interrogations. Young Archie Harker distinguished himself by going up the yard and trying to peep under the window blinds. He could see nothing, but gave reason for supposing that he did, and others of the Ipping youth presently joined him. It was the finest of all possible Whit Mondays, and down the village streets stood a row of nearly a dozen booths, a shooting gallery, and on the grass by the forge were 3 yellow and chocolate wagons, and some picturesque strangers of both sexes putting up a coconut shy. The gentlemen wore blue jerseys, the ladies white aprons and quite fashionable hats with heavy plumes. Whittier of Purple Fawn and Mr. Jaggers, the cobbler, who also sold old second-hand ordinary bicycles, were stretching a string of Union Jacks and Royal Ensigns, which had originally celebrated the first Victorian Jubilee, across the road. And inside the artificial darkness of the parlor, into which only one thin jet of sunlight penetrated, the stranger, hungry, we must suppose, and fearful, hidden in his uncomfortable hot wrappings, pored through the dark glasses upon his paper and chinked his dirty little bottles and occasionally swore savagely at the boys, audible if invisible outside the windows. In the corner by the fireplace lay the fragments of 6 smashed bottles, and a pungent twang of chlorine tainted the air. So much we know from what was heard at the time and from what was subsequently seen in the room. About noon he suddenly opened his parlor door and stood glaring fixedly at the 3 or 4 people in the bar. "Miss Hall," he said. Somebody went sheepishly and called for Miss Hall. Miss Hall appeared after an interval, a little short of breath, but all the fiercer for that. Hall was still out. She had deliberated over the scene, and she came holding a little tray with an unsettled bill upon it. Is it your bill you're wanting, sir?" she said. "Why wasn't my breakfast laid? Why haven't you prepared my meals and answered my bells? Do you think I live without eating?" "Why isn't my bill paid?" said Miss Hall. "That's what I want to know." "I told you 3 days ago I was waiting a remittance." "I told you 2 days ago I wasn't going to wait no remittances. You can grumble if your breakfast waits a bit. If my bill's been waiting these 5 days, can you?" The stranger swore briefly but vividly. "Na na!" from the bar. "And I'd thank you kindly, sir, if you'd keep your swearing to yourself, sir," said Miss Hall. The stranger stood looking more like an angry diving helmet than ever. It was universally felt in the bar that Miss Hall had the better of him. His next words showed as much. "Look here, my good woman," he began. "Don't good woman me," said Miss Hall. "I've told you my remittance hasn't come." "Remittance indeed," said Miss Hall. "Still, I dare say in my pocket. You told me 3 days ago that you hadn't anything but a sovereign's worth of silver upon you." "Well, I've found some more." "Hullo!" from the bar. "I wonder where you found it," said Miss Hall. That seemed to annoy the stranger very much. He stamped his foot. "What do you mean?" "That I wonder where you found it," said Miss Hall. "And before I take any bills or get any breakfast or do anything whatsoever, you got to tell me 1 or 2 things I don't understand, and what nobody don't understand, and what everybody is anxious to understand. I want to know what you were doing to my chair upstairs, and I want to know how it is your room was empty, and how you got in again. Them as stops in this house come in by the doors. That's the rule of the house, and that you didn't do. And what I want to know is how you did come in, and I want to know." Suddenly the stranger raised his hands, clenched, stamped his foot, and said, "Stop!" with such an extraordinary violence
He silenced her instantly. "You don't understand," he said, "who I am or what I am. I'll show you. By heaven, I'll show you." Then he put his open palm over his face and withdrew it. The center of his face became a black cavity. "Here," he said. He stepped forward and handed Miss Hall something which she, staring at the metamorphosed face, accepted automatically. Then, when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, dropped it, and staggered back. The nose, it was the stranger's nose, pink and shining, rolled on the floor. Then he removed his spectacles, and everyone in the bar gasped. He took off his hat, and with a violent gesture at his whiskers and bandages, for a moment they resisted him. A flash of horrible anticipation passed through the bar. "Oh my God!" said someone. Then they came off. It was worse than anything. Miss Hall, standing open-mouthed and horror-struck, shrieked at what she saw, and made for the door of the house. Everyone began to move. They were prepared for scars, disfigurements, tangible horrors, but nothing. The bandages and false hair flew across the passage into the bar, making them hobbledehoy and jump to avoid him. Everyone tumbled on everyone else down the steps, for the man who stood there shouting some incoherent explanation was a solid gesticulating figure up to the coat collar of him, and then nothingness. Nothing visible at all. People down the village heard the shouts and shrieks, and looking up the street, he saw a coach and horses violently firing out its humanity. They saw Miss Hall fall down and Mr. Teddy Humphrey jumping to avoid tumbling over her. And then they heard the frightful screams of Millie, who emerged and suddenly from the kitchen at the noise of the tumult had come upon the headless stranger from behind. These increased suddenly. Forthwith, everyone all down the street, and sweet stuff seller, coconut shy proprietor, and his assistant, the swing men, little boys and girls, rustic dandies, smart wenches, smocked elders, and aproned gypsies began running towards the inn. In a miraculously short space of time, a crowd of perhaps 40 people, and rapidly increasing, swayed and hooted and inquired and exclaimed and suggested in front of Miss Hall's establishment. Everyone seemed eager to talk at once, and the result was babel. A small group supported Miss Hall, who was picked up in the state of collapse. There was a conference, and incredible evidence of a ferocious eyewitness. "Oh, Bogey! What's he been doing then? Ain't hurt the girl, is he? Runs at it with a knife, I believed." "Naw, I tell ye, I don't mean no manner of speaking. I mean no harm without it. Nonsense! 'Tis some conjuring trick. Fetched off its wrappings, he did." In its struggles to see in through the open door, the crowd formed itself to a straggling wedge, with the more adventurous apex near the end. "He stood there for a moment. I heard the gal scream, and he turned. I saw her skirt to whisk, and he went after her. Didn't take 10 seconds. Back he comes with the knife in his hand, and the loaf stood there just as he was staring. Not a moment ago went in that there door. I tell ye, he ain't got no head at all. You just missed it in." There was a disturbance behind, and the speaker stopped to step aside for a little procession that was marching very resolutely towards the house. First Mr. Hall, very red and determined, then Mr. Bobby Jaffers and the village constable, and then the wary Mr. Wagers. They had come now, armed with a warrant. People shouted conflicting information of the recent circumstances. "Ed or no Ed," said Mr. Shavers, "I got to arrestin' and I will." Mr. Hall marched up the steps, marched straight to the door and parlor and flung it open. "Constable," he said, "do your duty." Jaffers marched in, Hall next, Wagers last. They saw in the dim light the headless figure racing them, with a gnawed crust of bread in one gloved hand and a chunk of cheese in the other. "That's him!" said Hall. "What the devil is this?" came in a tone of angry expostulation from the above the collar of the figure. "You're a damned run customer, mister," said Mr. Jaffers. "But Ed or no Ed, the warrant says a body, and duty's duty. Keep off," said the figure, starting back. Abruptly, he whipped down the bread and cheese, and Mr. Hall just grasped the knife on the table in time to save it. Off came the stranger's left glove, and was slapped in Jaffers' face. At another moment, Jaffers, cutting the short some statement concerning a warrant, had gripped him by the handless right wrist and caught his invisible throat. He got a sound kicking on the shin that made him shout, but he gripped his grip. Hall sent the knife sliding along the table to Wagers, who acted as goalkeeper for the offensive, so to speak, and then stepped forward as Jaffers and the crowd, swaying, and staggered towards him, clutching and heading in. A chair stood in the way and went aside with a crash as they came down together. "Get the feet!" said Jaffers between his teeth. Mr. Hall, endeavoring to act on instructions, received a sound kicking in the ribs that disposed of him for a moment, and Mr. Wagers, seeing the decapitated stranger had rolled over and got the upper side of Jaffers, retreated towards the door, knife in hand, and so collided with Mr. Huckster and the cider bridge Carter, coming to the rescue of law and order. At the same moment down came 3 or 4 bottles from the chiffonier and shot a web of pungency into the air of the room. "I'll surrender!" cried the stranger, though he had Jaffers down, and in another moment he stood up panting, a strange figure, headless and handless, for he had pulled off his right glove, now as well as his left. "It's no good," he said, as if sobbing for breath. It was the strangest thing in the world to hear that voice coming as if out of empty space, but the Sussex peasants are perhaps the most matter-of-fact people under the sun. Jaffers got up also and produced a pair of handcuffs. Then he stared. "I say," said Jaffers, brought up short by a dim realization of the incongruity of the whole business. "Darn it, can't use them as I can see." The stranger ran his arm down his waistcoat, and as if by miracle the buttons to which his empty sleeve pointed out became undone. Then he said something about his shin and stooped down. He seemed to be fumbling with his shoes and socks. "Why," said Huckster suddenly, "that's not a man at all. It's just an empty clothes. Look, you can see down his collar and the linings of his clothes. I could put my arm—" He extended his hand. It seemed to meet something in the air, and he drew it back with a sharp exclamation. "I'd wish you'd keep your fingers out of my eye," said the aerial voice in a tone of savage expostulation. "The fact is, I'm all here. Head, hands, lungs, and all of the rest of it. But it happens I'm invisible. It's a confounded nuance, but I am. That's no reason why I should be poked to pieces by every stupid bumpkin in Ipping, is it?" The suit of clothes, now all unbuttoned and hanging loosely upon its unseen support, stood up, arms akimbo. Several other of the men folks had now entered the room, so that it was closely crowded. "Invisible, eh?" said Huckster, ignoring the stranger's abuse. "Who ever heard of the likes of that? It's strange, perhaps, but it's not a crime. Why am I assaulted by the policeman in this fashion?" "Ah, that's a different matter," said Jaffers. "No doubt you are a bit difficult to see in this light, but I got a warrant, and it's all correct. Why I'm after ain't no invisibility. It's burglary. There's a house been broken into and money took." "Well?" "And circumstances certainly point—" "Stuff and nonsense," said the invisible man. "I hope so, sir, but I've got my instructions." "Well, I'll come. But no handcuffs." "It's the regular thing." "No handcuffs," stipulated the stranger. "Pardon me," said Jaffers. Abruptly the figure sat down, and before anyone could realize what was being done, The slippers, socks, and trousers had been kicked off under the table. Then he sprang up again and flung off his coat. "Here, stop that," said Jaffers, and suddenly realizing what was happening, he gripped at the waistcoat. It struggled, and the shirt slipped off of it and left it limply, empty in his hand. "Hold him! Once he gets his things up—" "Hold him!" cried everyone, and there was a rush at the fluttering white shirt, which was now all that was visible of the stranger. The shirt sleeve planted a shrewd blow in Hall's face that stopped his open-armed advance and sent him backward into old Twosome, the sexton. In another moment, the garment was lifted up and became convulsed and vacantly flapping about the arms, even as the shirt that is being thrusted over the man's head. Jaffers clutched at it, and only helped to pull it off. He was struck in the mouth, out of the air, and continually thrown his truncheon and smote Teddy Henfrey savagely upon the crown of his head. "Look out!" said everybody, fencing at random and hitting at nothing. "Hold him! Shut the door! Don't let him loose! I got something! Here he is!" A perfect babel of noises they made. Everybody, it seemed, was being hit all at once, and Sandy Wagers, knowing as ever, and his wits sharpened by a frightful blow in the nose, reopened the door and let the rout. The others, following incontently, were jammed for a moment in the corner by the doorway. The hitting continued. Phipps, the Unitarian, had a front tooth broken, and Hemfrey was injured in the cartilage of his ears. Jaffers was struck under the jaw, and turning, caught at something that intervened between them and Juxter in the melee, and prevented their coming together. He felt a muscular chest, and another, a moment. The whole mass of struggling, excited men shot out into the crowded hall. "I got him!" shouted Jaffers, choking and reeling through them all, and wrestling with purple face and swelling veins against his unseen enemy. Men staggered right and left as the extraordinary conflict swayed swiftly towards the house and went spinning down in a half-dozen steps of the inn. Jaffers cried in a strangled voice, holding tight, nevertheless, and making play with his knees, spun around and fell heavily undermost with his head on the gravel. Only then did his fingers relax. There was excited cries of "Hold him! Invisible!" and so forth, and a young fellow, a stranger in the place whose name did not come to light, rushed in at once, caught something, missed his hold, and fell over Constable's prostrate body. Halfway across the road a woman screamed as something pushed by her. A dog, kicked apparently, yelped and ran howling into Huckster's yard. And with that, the transit of the invisible man was accomplished. For a space, people stood amazed and gesticulating, and then came panic and scattered them abroad through the village as a gust scattered dead leaves. But Jaffers laid quite still, face upward, and knees bent at the foot of the steps of the inn. And that is the next 3 chapters that we are going to read. Thank you guys for being here. We're going to switch over to some scary video games such as Dead by Daylight. Hi Pug! Oh my goodness! I'm so sorry. Normally when I read, I kind of like ignore chat so that if people are